Well, we're very honored and I'm happy to have you participating in the Istanbul Biennial.
Sure, it's a very exciting event. I was in Istanbul a few years ago and I enjoyed it immensely.
Great, fantastic.
Terrific place, very romantic.
Fantastic. So we were very interested in your research in synesthesia and how it relates to art.
Yes, well, we've become interested in synesthesia for over a decade now, and it was first described by Francis Galton, who was the first cousin of Charles Darwin in sort of mid to late 19th century. Galton observed that some individuals who were otherwise quite normal in the general population had a following quirk in their mind, peculiarity. That is, every time they saw a number, they would see a specific color associated with the number. So they would see a printed number 5 in black and white. It would look tinged with red. 6 would be green, 7 would be yellow, 8 would be indigo, 9 would be chartreuse, so on and so forth. An utterly bewildering phenomenon, and we think we've found out what the cause is. And Galton also noticed that certain tones, in some of them tones are associated with color. It's called tone color synesthesia. F sharp might be blue, C sharp might be green, and so on and so forth. So we became very intrigued by this, and obviously Galton was. Galton also noticed it runs in families, and claimed it may have a hereditary basis, genetic basis. And he also noticed, since then people have noticed that it's much more common among artists, poets, and novelists. 8 times more common among artists, poets, and novelists. And why should that be? Here we have a little mystery we're waiting to be solved. And I first got into this business about 15 years ago. So the first thing we wanted to see was, is this real? Now these people are just making it up. What do you mean 5 is red, 6 is blue, 7 is green? It doesn't make any sense. Many theories have been proposed to explain synesthesia. One theory is these people are just crazy. And we devised some simple tests, perceptual tests, to show that they're not crazy. They really are seeing the colors when they see the numbers. Too complicated to explain, but involves using psychophysical measurements, perceptual measurements, to show that they're really seeing the colors. So we know it's real, the phenomenon of synesthesia. These people, when they see numbers, they actually see colors. So you could say, why does it happen? And why does it run in families? But it turns out that the brain of the fetus, the brain of the infant, every brain area is connected to every other brain area. There's a tremendous redundancy of connections, excess connections. And then there are pruning genes which come along and prune away the excess connections, creating the characteristic modular architecture of the adult brain. So there's a separate brain area for color, separate for number, separate for tone, and so on and so forth, even a separate area for faces. And it turns out, my student Ed Hubbard and I, we were struck by the fact that the color area in the brain, which processes color, is right next to the number area, which processes the visual appearance of numbers. Both of them are in a structure called the fusiform gyrus, tucked away in the inner side of the temporal lobes on both sides of the brain. So in the fusiform gyrus, you've got a number area that responds to numbers, and a color area which responds to colors, and they're right next to each other. You said, what's the likelihood that this is a coincidence? The most common type of synesthesia is number color synesthesia, and these two areas are right next to each other. So that gave us a clue. So we said maybe there's a cross-connectivity between these two areas for some reason in some people. And the reason might be that there's a defect in the pruning gene. Ordinarily, the number and color area would be clearly segregated. But in these people, there's a defective pruning gene. It fails to prune the connection between adjacent brain areas. And if the pruning gene is expressed selectively in the fusiform gyrus, not all over the brain, but selectively, so there's a flaw in the circuitry there, you're going to get excess connections between the color and number area, which are sort of lingering on from early fetal life. And this explains why there's crosstalk between color and number in these people, and why they see colors every time they see a number. The number activates a number neuron in the number area in the fusiform gyrus. That in turn evokes activity in an adjacent color neuron. So you see, every time you see 5, you see red, every time you see 6, you see green, and so on and so forth. And you could say, well, what's the big deal? You've shown that synesthesia is real, and that it probably is due to cross-wiring in the brain, cross-activation. And we did brain imaging with fMR to show that there is indeed cross-activation between color and number area, done by my student David Brang. And that's where things stood about 5-10 years ago. Then we wondered why it's more common among artists, poets, and novelists. Why is what do artists, poets, and novelists have in common? They're all good at metaphor. When they say it is the east and Juliet is the sun. What do you mean Juliet is the sun? She's not a glowing ball of fire. You mean Juliet is radiant like the sun, warm like the sun, nurturing like the sun, so on and so forth. The brain finds appropriate links. Shakespeare, of course, is a master at evoking these different, many layers of metaphor in a single metaphor, many layers of meaning. So what's this got to do with synesthesia? Well, a metaphor is linking two seemingly unrelated concepts, like a celestial body like the sun, and a young lady like Juliet, right, to illuminate certain aspects of her. It's finding links between two seemingly utterly dissimilar conceptual entities, a young lady and a part of the solar system, center of the solar system. Now, if you assume that concepts are also scattered in far-flung regions of the brain, there's greater connectivity in synesthetes between different brain regions, which are not necessarily adjacent, but far-flung brain regions, defective pruning. The defective pruning gene is expressed throughout the brain instead of just in the fusiform gyrus. You're going to get a greater propensity to link seemingly unrelated ideas and concepts. In other words, you're going to get a greater propensity towards metaphorical thinking. In other words, what I'm saying is this defective pruning gene expressed selectively in the fusiform gyrus, you're going to get this quirky form of cross-sensory association, which you call synesthesia, numbers evoking colors. But if it's expressed throughout the brain, you're going to get an increased propensity to link seemingly unrelated ideas and concepts, making you more prone to creating new metaphors, which is the basis of artistic creativity. So you can start with synesthesia. We think we can identify the genes, maybe, people are looking. Let's go from the gene to the neuroanatomy, fusiform gyrus, or other parts of the brain, depending on the type of synesthesia. From there to genetic mechanism, what might be causing it, perceptual experiments to show that in fact it's a real phenomenon, all the way to Shakespeare and metaphor, all starting with this real, simple little quirky phenomenon that you see in some people called synesthesia.
It's fascinating. Like the defective pruning it's amazing to think that artists have this defective pruning that would give them this kind of creative skill.
Absolutely. I mean, another question that emerges is why do we not all have this gene, defective pruning, make us all metaphorical and creative? The problem with that is evolution takes time. Give it another 50,000, 100,000 years, maybe we'll all become more artistic. The world would be a better place. But I think the real answer is you don't want everybody being artistic. You need engineers, you need brain surgeons. You don't want, if a surgeon is doing surgery on your brain, you don't want him getting creative and metaphorical on you. You want precision, not creativity. So to ensure the heterogeneity of phenotype, you don't want everybody to be a synesthete.
I had a question. You've seen Annie Besant's Thought Form book. Would you say that would be related to the Kiki Bouba experiment?
Yes, indeed. Well, thinking about synesthesia, which is really about cross-sensory associations, like tone evoking color, sound evoking light, or number evoking color, so various types of cross-sensory association depending on what type of synesthesia you're talking about. God is thinking about cross-sensory associations in general, not pathological ones, not abnormal ones or strange ones, but something we all do. One striking example of this is what we call the Bouba-Kiki effect, which is not discovered by us, but by Gestalt psychologists, including Kerler. And essentially you take two shapes, one sort of amoeboid shape and one star-like shape. They're both nonsense shapes, they don't mean anything, obviously. And then you give them to normal people, and you tell them one of these is a Kiki and the other one is a Bouba. Just as letters of the alphabet, the letter A is A, B, each grapheme or each shape has a particular sound associated with it in English. I tell them this is Martian alphabet. One of them is Bouba, the other one is Kiki. Which one is Bouba, which one is Kiki? And 95 to 98% of people pick this is Bouba and this is Kiki, even though they've never seen these shapes before. Why would that be? Well, it's really an astonishing effect if you think about it, and I think we pointed out its potential relevance for understanding the evolution of language, evolution of proto-language rather than deep structure of language. Now, how might that have happened? Well, the old theory of language, early language development, early language evolution, is what we call Sageurian, that is, there is no similarity between the correspondence between an object and the sound, the word that represents the object, is completely arbitrary. Right? So dog is chien in French, nai in Tamil, and dog in English, and these three words have nothing in common: the shape or appearance of a dog. That is held to be true of all languages. But we claim that may be true currently, but it's not true when the languages first emerged, right? People didn't sit around the fireplace and say, this is a pig. Everybody say pig, pig, and then invent words like that. So how did it happen? We think there's an innate propensity to link certain shapes with certain sounds. And so here, for example, most people say this curved shape is Bouba, the jagged shape is Kiki. Why would that be? As I said, it's really astonishing because if you look at the word, the letter Kiki, the word Kiki, sound of the word Kiki, it's a bunch of hair cells in your ear being excited sequentially. Kiki, 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 Kiki. That in turn evokes activity in the auditory cortex, nerve impulses, corresponding to the sound you played, versus the visual shape, the jagged shape, excites a bunch of photoreceptors hitting the retina in parallel, going and exciting the visual areas in the brain, including area 17, area 18, fusiform iris. So the pattern of activity evoked in the neurons is utterly dissimilar in the two cases. One is sequentially activating hair cells in the ear, represented in the auditory cortex. The other is parallel activation of cone and rod cells in the retina, going and activating visual areas. Yet the brain immediately says these two have something in common, namely the abstract quality of jaggedness or kikiness. So the brain is, not to mention the tongue undulating on the palate, and pulling off suddenly ki, versus in the amoeboid shape, it's boo-ba, gentle undulation of the tongue. Again, they have nothing in common except the property of undulation, right? Or in Fourier space, it's got high spatial frequency, this doesn't, in mathematical space. But the brain, somehow, the neurons are able to extract this metaphor, if you like. In a sense, it's a kind of a metaphor, because metaphor, Juliet and the sun. Juliet is a young woman, sun is a celestial object. They have nothing in common. One is the one who's got hair, the other one doesn't have hair, one has a nose, the other one doesn't have a nose. Hundreds of things they don't have in common, but they do have something in common. They're both radiant, they're both nurturing, they're both warm, so on and so forth, right? So, there are two overlapping meanings which have two penumbras of meanings, sun and Juliet. They overlap to a certain extent. The overlapping zone is what's called a metaphor, radiant and nurturing and warm. Similarly, the Kiki shape, the Kiki sound have nothing in common except for the jaggedness or the kikiness, suddenness. So you could say it's a metaphor of sorts.
And would you say, do you remember Annie Besant's Thought Forms book with the kind of emotion shapes?
Yes, I'm very intrigued by that because she, from pure intuition, she came up with these shapes. Which have certain colors and certain shapes have certain associated emotions. And we would be very interested in testing this on a systematic basis by giving people who have never seen these shapes before or colors before a choice, asking them to pick the correct one, to see if you get the Bouba Kiki phenomenon in Annie Besant's shapes and colors.
We hope to be able to do that at the biennial, if possible.
Yes, that would be very exciting, very intriguing to try that.
So your presence will be shared among lots of visitors, hopefully.
I'm delighted to hear it.
So another question I had was the 10 principles of art that you developed.
Yes.
Because you've always had a strong interest in art. Would you say that they still hold true, or would you say that there needs to be some kind of reframing of those principles, that to take into account cultural or social conditions?
Well, I always said right from the beginning that we're not dealing with the cultural aspects of art because but that's most of art is cultural and influenced by arbitrary things like the auctioneer. And of course culture plays a tremendous role. But as a scientist, I'm interested in what's not influenced by culture, the core of it, which may have a genetic basis and may cut across cultural boundaries. In fact, even across species boundaries. So, why do we find butterflies attractive? It's not because butterflies evolved to be attractive to us, not because of culture, but because butterflies evolved to be attractive to other butterflies. Sorry, I'll repeat that.
That's good.
You have to cut that part off.
That's good. Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Restate it, yeah. So, we're interested in general principles that cut across not just cultural boundaries, but phylogenetic boundaries or species boundaries. For example, butterflies evolved to be beautiful to other butterflies, not to us, but we do find them beautiful. There are aesthetic principles like symmetry and grouping which I think are universal, not based on culture. These are the principles we're interested in. But to answer your question, I think yes, it does require reformulation and reframing. Not in terms of culture, but that was just a first pass attempt to come up with some laws of aesthetics, which nobody had attempted before. And then there are lots of people working on it now, but we haven't pushed it very far since that time.
Right. And in terms of the first pass or future projects, what's your upcoming focus of research, would you say?
Well, we're interested in all sorts of things. We're interested in aspects of synesthesia which haven't been explored before. Also the savant syndrome, where somebody has a knock on his head or a stroke and suddenly develops extraordinarily islands of talent, which the person himself never knew he had it. Extraordinary blossoming of new talent, which is very, very intriguing. Been known for a long time but brushed aside, and these are the kinds of phenomena we often focus on and solve. Of course, five phenomena, we only solved one. People don't hear about the four that we didn't solve. But we've not made any headway yet with savants. We're still looking for savant syndrome.
And in terms of savants, would you say that most artists have some aspect of savant syndrome in them, or?
And we all do to some extent, but in its heightened form, it's extremely puzzling and intriguing, and we'd like to study that, hopefully understand diversity of talents we see even in quote-unquote non-savant, normal people.
Mm-hmm. And that's caused usually by some accident, or?
Yeah, I mean, there are claims that somebody's struck by lightning, or somebody has a stroke, or somebody has a head injury, and suddenly this unleashes a hidden potential which they never knew existed before. And to me, that's very, very intriguing. The chap called Alan Snyder in Australia was also interested in this topic.
Is there anything that you could recommend to the people listening to you in this auditorium now to become more creative, let's say?
We're not there yet. I mean, I would say that it's common sense. I mean, hang around people who are creative and passionate about what they do, and avoid bores. Huxley once said, bores are the great enemy of civilization, greatest enemy of civilization. Hang around passionate people who enjoy what they do. The passion is contagious, nothing more contagious than passion. And read widely, obviously. That's a catalyst to creativity. But this is just common sense. It doesn't come from any deep insight into the brain.
And is there a way to train the brain to find these connections between the different brain centers, let's say, to become synesthetic in a way?
Well, if there is one, I don't know about it. But I think, again, teaching people humor, because humor often involves unusual juxtapositions of ideas. Poetry and humor are both extremely important. It should be taught very early in schools. And visual art, of course. And that's not done very, very much. It's played down. It's all been taken over by science, unfortunately. Science is very important, but not at the expense of the humanities.